Hello, welcome back to the 18th episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York, and my podcast is about culture wars, disinformation and misinformation stories. It's about the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with dramatic and emotive subjects instead of the real issues. It's about small things blown up to upset and distract people. It's about made-up causes and astroturf organisations, meaning organisations invented by PRs and lobbyists after the pattern of the American fake grass brand. I'll be talking to the players and the commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening and not happening because it's made up. And then we can ask some vital questions, do a bit of lifestyle and shopping and so forth if we've got time. Tom Mills is a sociologist. He's an academic. He's a senior lecturer at Aston University, which is in the Midlands. He specialises in the relationship between media and politics. Before Aston, he was at Bath, which is down in the southwest, Bath University, between 2008 and 2015, and he took his PhD there. He's also an occasional journalist on his subjects, and the author of a very important book about the BBC. It's called The BBC Myth of a Broadcaster, which came out in 2014 when he was practically just out of school. He's also a leading light in the Media Reform Coalition, which is an organisation that analyses mainly UK media and lobbies for its reform in various ways. The MRC believes UK commercial media is unrepresentative of the nation and doesn't serve it well. Too much, so they say, in too few hands. So, for instance, 90% of print sales of UK national newspapers are produced by just 3 companies, and our main public service broadcaster, the BBC, is subject to too much pressure from the establishment and so forth. These are the things that the Media Reform Coalition lobbies about. I came across Tom Mills and his BBC book back in 2019 when Professor Patrick Barwise and I were writing our BBC book, The War Against the BBC, which came out at the end of 2020. Now, they were very different books. His is a political history and ours is an analysis of the BBC's then current situation. Ours was intended, rather vulgarly, to name the guilty men and women who wanted to kill or cripple the BBC for their own commercial or ideological reasons. We initially, Patrick and I, thought Tom's book was very clever, but a bit too doctrinaire lefty for us. After we'd finished our book, we admitted to ourselves that he'd actually got quite a bit right, particularly in showing the BBC's vulnerability to the government of the day, whatever it was, because their control of its funding reduced its independence. Tom Mills, welcome to the Culture Wars discussion. Media is central to the Culture Wars issue. How do you think UK media land has changed since you wrote your BBC book in 2014?
How's the BBC and the media environment changed? I mean, to some extent, the trends which are already underway have accelerated. So I wrote the book about the BBC some years ago now, and some of the trends I thought were worrying in terms of the relative independence of the BBC from government, but also less talked about, like the commercialisation of the BBC and the reduction in its public funding, that's all still not only a live issue, but in some ways I think has worsened. And then the concentration of the press that you mentioned, I mean, that's based on the Media Reform Coalition's recent publication, Who Owns the UK Media, which is a sort of occasional report that we put out. So it gets updated every couple of years or so with new figures. And indeed, the figures, the concentration goes up, I think, from like around 80% to around 90%. So we see an acceleration of these trends in terms of like these institutions. So insofar as those are recognised as being bad or problems, they've become even more so in the intervening period. And then, of course, we've had, at the same time as this increase in concentration, a sort of acceleration of some other underlying trends that have undermined the capacity for professional journalism, even in the existing institutions. So obviously, like the rise of the sort of digital platforms and social media has had a very profound effect on the industry. And to some extent, I think it can be argued that the kind of political economy, if you like, of the tabloid media, which was always based on market expansion, sensationalism, and selling of papers, has sort of fractured into that kind of practice and stories as well. So like the classic model of like the newspaper was you attract people with these sort of headlines, and then they've got the whole package of news in that day that they may be exposed to. So you can kind of, if you like, cross-subsidize different types of news content. I mean, this was common practice really in the media of the 20th and early 21st century. Well, we have a sort of a shift now towards like more sensationalist stories, what gets called clickbait, right? So if you look at something like the Daily Mail, they become a very successful online platform and producing or publishing video content around their particular stories. So I think like some of the trends which would be very familiar to your listeners in terms of like sensationalism, in terms of like pushing particular kinds of agendas, which has always been the editorial position of the Daily Mail, has sort of been exacerbated by this sort of clickbait economy, which has spread as a result of social media and the platform. So I think when you're looking at the British media system, you've got to recognise there are all these sort of different parts with like different pressures, different models, different like professional standards, but they are also all influencing each other in different ways. I mean, what one problem with the BBC, I think, that's quite well recognised now, and I've written about a lot, is the extent to which the press has been able to sort of drive the overall political agenda, and that's obviously very important for what gets called like culture war issues. And the BBC, supposedly acting as a sort of more professionalised, public orientated bulwark against these kind of commercial and private interests, its capacity to do that is obviously limited if these other organisations are able to set the political and cultural agenda.
So you're saying, well, one, nothing's got better since 2014. Some things have got decidedly worse, and there are new factors like the Mail inventing whole story packages with full motion video. Are you saying that the BBC rushes behind the Daily Mail wishing to pick up its stories?
Yeah, I mean, there is some research in this actually, which is looking less at the kinds of stories that you focus on the podcast and more on like the political agenda. So there was some work that was done by Cardiff University, which was some time ago now, I think, like looking at the 2015 election. And what they did was they looked at the issues which were of interest to people, if you look at polling, and then they looked at the editorial priorities of the press. And the BBC's reporting overall, like obviously the BBC does lots of different reporting, but insofar as you can measure it, was much closer to the political priorities of the press than it was to what was actually seen as being a priority for people. Now, sometimes this is kind of difficult to untangle, right? Because the press has this agenda setting function, if it goes on and on and on about the story, eventually people start to think that that's important. I mean, that's one thing that the media is quite good at, is getting people to think about certain things. But I think the evidence is pretty strong that, yeah, the press has an ability to shift stories in a particular direction, and the BBC is kind of responsive to that. I mean, it's one of the things which, if you talk to BBC journalists, they have a really strong sense that like their editorial and professional sort of ethos is very distinct from the Daily Mail. But at the same time, there tends to be this really strong sense that what's a story is a story, right? And somehow that's kind of defined in like a politically neutral way. Oh, everybody's talking about this, so therefore it is a story. And if you deny that it's relevant, they can get quite annoyed about that. I mean, I think part of the reason is that like politicians obviously have an interest in trying to deflect questions by saying, oh, people aren't interested in this or that, and questioning people's angles on things. But I think the BBC just doesn't take that seriously enough, right? The reason why particular things are a story, or to use like the journalistic cliche, the reason why things have legs. What happens in politics, I think, is that if the Daily Mail goes off on one for a day or two, right, a politician can kind of weather the storm. If the Daily Mail keeps reporting about something constantly, non-stop, and then the BBC will start treating that as if it's a major news story, right? And we see this on all kinds of issues. So just to backpedal slightly in terms of like, has everything got worse? I mean, yes, I think the simple answer is it has. I wouldn't want to be like completely negative. I think there are aspects, for example, of social media, which can have a positive aspect to them. I mean, I think basically like a lot of these platforms are very socially dysfunctional, but I wouldn't want to go so far as to say they've been completely bad. One thing that they are better at is offering ordinary people a platform to question particular kinds of editorial agendas. Now, that's obviously a double-edged sword, right? There's also an extent to which it can spread misinformation, misunderstandings, particular issues being naturally overblown just by the nature of how sort of reactive it is. But there are good elements to it as well, right? I wouldn't really be wanting to go back to a situation before, which was basically a relatively small group of people, some of whom are sitting in Broadcasting House and some of whom are sitting in the offices of the Daily Mail or News International, just decide of their own accord what the news is and nobody else is allowed to answer back. I think the challenge is more, is there a way which we can have that dialogue which is more constructive and more conducive to sort of democratic public life? So I'm not saying, to be clear, that social media is necessarily a good thing, but I think one of the things that made my book slightly distinctive compared to some analysis of the UK media is that I've usually rejected, and so have other people working at the MRC, that sort of classic patrician model of editorial autonomy and trying to find ways beyond that. So I just thought that was worth clarifying as well.
But the precise relationship between the Broadcasting House and, I was going to call it Rothermere House, but it makes it sound as if the Mail is driving the car, as if they are inventing things, and then the BBC, in their wisdom and touching faith in the Mail's representativeness, tags onto it and makes it bigger yet and gives it more gravitas.
Well, I think obviously the Daily Mail does invent things, right? But they're smart enough to not. I mean, sometimes they do just invent things out of complete thin air, and you can look at stories and investigate them, and usually you find sometimes there is smoke without fire. In most cases, what they're doing is they're just arranging a series of things that did happen to just give a wholly misrepresented picture of what's actually going on. Or that, as you said from the start, just misrepresents the scale or harmfulness of the particular issue. So if the Daily Mail purely invents something, usually the BBC isn't going to run with it. I think it's more that, so it's a couple of things. Like one, if it's a particular story with aspects of truth, which is having a lot of attention, and yeah, the BBC will run with that. The other thing is that sometimes it will just be not so much invented things, but particular issues which are represented in a certain sort of a way, like say like the small boats, as we all have to say now, like what is really like the migrant crisis. I mean, from the perspective of people migrating more than the perspective of people here, that's something which we can't say is completely invented, but yeah, the BBC is very responsive to that kind of agenda. And I don't think, not just the Daily Mail, of course, it's also politicians. If all the politicians in Westminster speak with one voice about a particular issue, and one voice but different rhythms, different sort of takes, different positions, but if everyone recognises that this phenomenon is a problem that needs to be addressed, whether it's, I mean, there was a recent case of Israeli football hooligans being denied attending a away game in Birmingham, for example. Representatives from every political party took a particular position on it, even more so than the Daily Mail. That's something which the BBC will always respond to. They do use the Daily Mail as a sort of barometer of popular...
Real people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there's important reasons why they think about the Daily Mail that way, and we can talk about them. But the other thing is that Parliament becomes the ultimate sort of barometer of, authentic, legitimate, sanctioned opinion. So the politicians are also... they're attentive to what's going on in the press. They don't want the Daily Mail to turn on them. And sometimes they're using the Daily Mail as their barometer for this is how we reach ordinary people, who at the moment is reform voters. BBC itself is trying to actively cater to reform voters. I mean, I don't know if you saw this story, but...
I did see that story. What did you make of it? If you've not caught up with this story, it's a story this year, and it says basically the top level of BBC News, they talked about how they could change their news and current affairs offer to be more interesting to reform voters. I think that's roughly it. How they could be more relevant to the concerns of reform voters, which looked rather odd.
It did look odd. I mean, just to add that it wasn't just on news and current affairs. It seems from what was reported that this was as much as anything like a cultural agenda, which seems to be like real focus of the Daily Mail, like anything to do with documentaries or dramas and these kinds of things, this sort of sense of who we are in the world as a country, right, and how we define ourselves. These are the things that really get a lot of the people at the Daily Mail and like News International agitated. And it seemed like they were referring to their cultural output as well. I mean, on the one hand, like the BBC has to obviously cater to all audiences, but the question becomes, well, who do they have in mind when they're talking about reform voters, right? Are they catering to those voters in particular? Do they have the same anxieties about representatives from other political parties who also feel like angry towards the BBC? Are there particular types or senses of what issues that they are trying to appeal to? And if the sentiment is purely anti-immigrant, well, how do you reconcile that with the basically sort of soft multicultural model that's really embedded within the idea of public service broadcasting? I mean, the truth is we don't know. We're having to join the dots to figure out what's going on behind the scenes. But on the other hand, we have lots of statements from the BBC leadership, and we have a good sense of who these people are. Just the other day, Tim Davie had this very strange interview that was reported in a number of outlets about, people shouldn't be allowed to wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts in the newsroom. I don't know who was wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts in the newsroom, but then he, in the same sentence, said the BBC stands against racism. Now, I don't know quite what he means by that or what he thinks Black Lives Matter stand for, but the implication seemed to be in that statement that Black Lives Matter isn't simply against racism, there's some sort of covert political agenda that the rest of us don't know about. Well, why is it on the one hand they're having behind the scenes meetings talking about how can we appeal to reform voters, where on the other hand there seems to be this sort of blanket hostility towards an anti-racist social movement? It makes very little sense. And actually, even from the BBC's kind of legitimacy, socially conservative voters who tend to be attracted to reform are probably less amenable to the BBC, and obviously the BBC needs to cater to them. But equally, what are ethnic minority licence fee payers supposed to make of the people who they're paying extraordinary amounts of money, by the way, to represent them and represent Britain, making these sort of off-the-cuff remarks about how Black Lives Matter is somehow beyond the pale, but in the context of a very, I think, frightening series of political mobilisations by the right, at the same time saying, we need to engage with these people. This has been a long story at the BBC, by the way. I mean, I remember when I started writing the book, there was this very bizarre episode where the BBC commissioned this programme called Whiteness Week, which was sort of trying to sort of engage with the same sorts of attitudes. And I think it's sort of indicative of where the BBC sees itself in the British media ecology. They see themselves as being like the good educated liberals, and somehow, huge swathes of the population as being uneducated tabloid readers who are basically socially conservative. If you look at polling data, what you really find is, people are very split, across these kinds of issues. I mean, on some issues you find strong majority positions. really the key thing, which everyone in Britain seems to share, is a sort of commitment to a sort of basically centre-left economic agenda. So public ownership of certain utilities, slightly higher redistributive taxes, sort of things like railways that work, and then affordability issues. Like, these are the kinds of things which represent concerns for people, and it's precisely the role of the conservative press to use misdirection and to deflect from those kinds of issues. Why? Well, I mean, the reason is really straightforward, and no one's allowed to say it on the BBC because you're not allowed to make a reality-based statement about the British press. But basically, these are institutions which are owned by billionaires and have commercial models. So they either cater towards high-income demographics, so that's like the Financial Times, to some extent the Guardian as well, and of course the Times. And then the Times, of course, is owned by News International, and then we have the Daily Mail and the rest of them. They're all owned by very, very rich people, some who don't even live in the UK. What do these organisations do? What have they always done? They've tried to square a circle. They've tried to find a way where they can build a level of popular support around particular issues which is amenable to the political interests of owners and advertisers. And that's how you get this very strange, volatile, often incoherent set of political dispositions which come out of things like the Daily Mail, right? Their audience are sort of predominantly lower middle class, right? But their owners are billionaires. How do you do that? You try and figure out what are the issues which we can all agree on, and you produce content very explicitly geared towards that editorial position. I mean, I remember when I was quite young, just out of university, before I'd started doing research on the British media, speaking to somebody who just got a job at the Daily Mail as a sub-editor. I didn't really know much about the media at that point, so I was just like, oh, well, what does that involve? And of course, people know, like, sub-editing normally involves crossing the T's, dotting the I's, and this kind of business, and trying to make your ideas a bit clearer. The Daily Mail, like, the job was clear. It said, we just give things the Daily Mail sort of spin. I was like, all right, what's that? Oh, the usual thing. Migrants are ruining the country. The left's a bunch of loonies, etc., etc. This is what, and they're very explicit about that. I mean, it's not that. Of course, there are people at the Daily Mail like genuinely, authentically committed to a certain type of politics, but a lot of people who work at the Daily Mail, they're just paid cynics, really. If you went on the BBC on like Question Time and then started saying that the Daily Mail was owned by billionaires and is just designed to spread misinformation and essentially corrupt the public sphere, which is what these institutions do. I mean, just, we're all supposed to pretend like Leveson never happened, right? You can imagine the kind of panic which you would get from like people on the BBC. Well, I'm sure the Daily Mail would say X, Y, and Z. Well, of course they would. Of course they would.
Now, you're saying that the BBC lives in a desperate fear of the Daily Mail and its friends because of the various pressures they can exert, and also seeks to follow their van and copy what they do. Well, that's a pretty terrible pair of developments, isn't it? How long has it done that?
I mean, to some extent, it's always followed a sort of centre-right editorial position. I mean, the thing is with the BBC is that, like, people often think about the cultural products or the documentaries, which tended to be much more independent of the political system, or even sections of current affairs. Really, like, the news agenda has never been so different to like the Times or even the Telegraph. I mean, when I was originally in the archive, I remember the BBC itself, this was way back in the 1970s, had commissioned a piece of work looking at headlines on the BBC. What did they run on the BBC? What did ITV run? What did the Times run? What did the Telegraph run? And it was the Telegraph that the BBC, they found the BBC was closest to. Now, the Telegraph was a very different sort of outlet then, but they were quite pleased with this, right? They didn't think it was a point of concern, because the Telegraph was seen as a sort of sensible voice of British conservatism, and of course connected to the Conservative Party, but not quite sort of Thatcherite, at least at that. Well, they were very Thatcherite actually, but like this was in the 70s, right? So they weren't quite as closely aligned to what we now call a sort of neoliberal new right wing. So they've always been a bit aligned to the right. But I think what really it was the period after the 1980s and especially during the 1990s that the BBC really felt much, much weaker, not only in comparison, not only worried about the press, because the press were railing against the BBC in the 1980s, but because of the alliance between the government and the press. I mean, that was the key thing, right? So up until the 80s, they were really quite brave and sometimes standing against some of the political pressure they faced. But it was the departure of Alistair Milne. I mean, this is ancient history now, in the 1980s, and then a more sort of cautious turn in the 1990s. And it's sort of, it comes and goes, right? So if the BBC's got a good amount of income and it's not worried about what the next government's going to do, then they will be more independent. And if their income's cut and they're worried about it being cut even more, or they're worried about getting a bad license deal or a charter renewal, then they're going to rein things in. We're very, very much in the latter position now because the BBC's been cut to the bone. I mean, by the way, sometimes people think about editorial issues and like funding as being separate. And it's just, the thing is, it just isn't. Like, it's not just like that funding allows people at the BBC to do more interesting things, right? That they have more resources for journalism, for program making, more able to take risks. I mean, that's all the case. However, the other thing that funding does, and anybody who's ever worked in like a big organization will notice that if your funding's cut, what happens is it puts you under a lot more pressure in your work, but also it just smashes morale at the organization and it makes people less self-confident. It makes people less self-confident also with reference to management structures, right? So if you're in an organization where the funding's getting cut, you're in a much less strong position to turn around and say no to people above you. Or let's put it this way, like your editor will be much more self-confident if they're not dependent on the people above them or they're not under huge economic pressure. So what I'm saying is that the money itself has an impact on the culture and managerial culture of the organization. That's all happened at the BBC, right? And what you find is, because some people think of markets as marketization, as creating more freedom. I mean, I suppose there could be some context in which that's true. At the BBC, managerial authority, like top-down hierarchical managerial authority and marketization have just gone hand in hand. I mean, that's been the story of the BBC really since the 1990s. And both of them have accelerated in the last 10 years.
You're thinking of Bertism.
Bertism in the 1990s, but like that was, I mean, it wasn't commented much on, but like under Tony Hall, like that really accelerated. So you had like the privatization, you had the creation of like BBC Studios and the expansion of commercial internal market politics of the Bert era. You've got a situation now where like the BBC is making programs for other broadcasters. So you may have noticed if you're on Netflix or whatever, you can see BBC content, right? That's been quite normal for a while, that the BBC's selling its content to other platforms because that increases its revenue. They're now making content for companies and other platforms that never gets on the BBC. I mean, that's the products of the BBC's commercialization. And like from a public perspective, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot here. Why, when you've got a well-respected, a one-time well-funded broadcaster to a creative industry, would you weaken that by integrating it into exactly the market, which is undermining its distinctiveness and its economic capacity? I mean, it's complete madness.
How do overseas media owners and new media and new people bear on that story you told about what's happened since 2014, all of which sounds pretty grim? There don't appear to be any emerging trends towards happiness. What about overseas and new stuff?
What kind of things do you have in mind? Overseas ownership of platforms?
Yep. Overseas ownership of platforms, outsider ownership of platforms, like the amazing thing that is GB News, which is partly overseas owned and partly multimillionaire owned. Well, in both cases, multimillionaires, one inside and one outside, but both of them outside the traditional media frameworks. They aren't media people. Legatum and Sir Paul Marshall were not, by background, media people.
Yeah. So in these cases, you've got very rich people with like very clear sort of political commitments and agendas. They've been quite open about it. So they're not, you're right, they're not buying media for media's sake. They understand it very clearly and state as such that ownership of media is a way of influencing the political and cultural agenda. I mean, the thing is, Murdoch understood politics in very similar sort of ways. I mean, the difference is that he came from a commercial and family background, like in media, so it didn't seem as strange to people. But people have always recognized media as being like instruments of political influence. And to take the other obvious example, with Twitter, now X, Elon Musk didn't buy Twitter as purely a platform for commercial exploitation, or if he did, he didn't really think through it very much and then seemed to decimate the capacity of the company when he bought it. His original intention seemed to be around like political commitment to what he calls freedom of speech. Now, we're not going to have time to have a long debate about what that means in this context, but actually the politics there around freedom of speech, which seems to have also really incensed Paul Marshall, is clearly one that is committed to a particular type of politics. They tend to see sort of socially liberal culture as being sort of censorious and like shaping what people can say and what people can think, and we need this sort of ideological pushback against this and so on and so forth. They've had, yes, I think quite an important influence. I think Elon Musk, he's not popular in the UK. I think his mainstream political influence is relatively limited. However, we can see it on the margins, right? I mean, there was that far-right rally in London not so long ago where Elon Musk was speaking. We're going to see a huge concentration of, we see already a huge concentration of ownership in the US tech sector, which is going to be more intense, partly because I think what we're seeing now is the digital platforms sort of becoming more enmeshed in like American geopolitical interests, and obviously the rise of Trump. Well, the rise of Trump, he's been rising for a long time, hasn't he? The presence of Trump, the second wind of Trump, let's say. We have a huge concentration there of power, which is overseas. And in the tech sector, I mean, it's one thing like the concentration in the British media sector. Some of these guys are, as I said, like sort of non-doms anyway. They don't have any sort of, let's say, economic stake in the country that they're influencing through their outlets. However, those are still institutions much more under the control of the British state. So, yeah, these international platforms do pose a real problem. I mean, I think from any perspective, not only to British democracy, but anywhere outside the United States. And obviously there's Chinese platforms as well. I mean, but the Europeans are just totally dropped the ball with this because, they basically just sort of said, oh, if these big technology companies are developed in the United States, that's fine by us. We don't need a technology sector. And before you know it, they've been completely overrun. I mean, the EU has been slightly more assertive when it comes to these big tech companies than the United Kingdom. But obviously, given that the United Kingdom is outside of that political and economic bloc now, it does present like real dilemmas.
I had someone called Angus Hanton on a couple of conversations back, and he's written a book called Vassal State, which explains how, as a consequence of America owning nearly 30% of us in various ways, some of those ways the fastest growing or most important ways, what he calls the bridges, the technological bridges in society, they are able to tell us what to do to a greater extent than they are comparably sized European countries, where the total of American ownership in the major European economies is less than their investment in this country. So if we say they own 30% of this country, they own very much less of European countries because there's legislation and pressure to stop it happening. Whereas we, since Thatcher, have said, come on in, it's lovely, buy what you want.
I mean, the country has just been for then being put up for sale, right? There's a line in that Elvis Costello song about Thatcherism: when England was a whore of the world, Margaret was her madam. And I never quite understood what it meant when I was listening to it. And then I thought, oh, he's trying to say, oh, yeah, she sold off the country, right? Sold off to silver. But yeah, it's been a political choice that's been pursued. There's no objective reason why Britain had to sell off all of its industry. I mean, of course, there were lots of claims made about the benefits of privatisation and market creation. I don't think that Thatcher really wanted to do any of that. I mean, maybe I'm being too kind to her, but I get the sense she was probably too much of a nationalist to really want to sell off everything and everything to not work. But who knows? It doesn't really matter what she thought, because she's dead now. But that's what happened as a result of Thatcher and the people around her. But, you know, every government since then has pursued extraordinarily self-defeating economic policy, and there's been a few people here and there, you know, making noise about industrial strategy. But what does that really amount to? I mean, it seems like with the current Labour government that the position is, right, we need investment, and so we want foreign direct investment. Well, we've always had foreign direct investment. The question is, what's the consequence of that investment going to be? If all you're going to do is go abroad and say, well, let's get a big private equity firm or these giant asset investment management companies to come and buy up care homes or veterinarian clinics or pieces of the NHS.
Or Cadbury's or Morrison's or Boots.
Anything, any well-known high street firm, but also it's not even just like the big firms, right? That's why I mentioned like things like care homes and like the vets and things like this, like these little things that everyone takes for granted as being like part of ordinary British life. I mean, for people who probably the kinds of people who do buy the Daily Mail as much as anybody else, there's this sort of, I think, pervasive sense. I mean, we're getting a little bit off media and culture wars here, but there's this pervasive sense that like something's gone wrong in this country, but never really any sense about quite how that happened. And I think why that book was good actually is it really does give you this sort of sense of under everybody's nose how all the things which were distinctive or like part of the fabric of everyday life have just been taken away from us in this country, and nobody really ever bothered to ask us whether we wanted to do that. I mean, Thatcher was popular in her own way. I mean, she was very electorally successful, but like nobody who was voting for Thatcher was saying, not nobody, some people were in favour of privatisation, but it was a very small number of people really, if you look at the polling. People have been in favour, if you look at like social attitudes surveys of public ownership from the 1980s up to today. Like the politicians don't do anything about it. Is that a culture war issue? Why don't people talk about that? And the reason they don't is none of the politicians are talking about it. Now, if a politician starts talking about it, then suddenly they're sated. There's something wrong with that person and the press goes after them to no end. This is the kind of dysfunctional politics we've been having to put up with for the last few decades. And behind that, I think, is this sort of media ecology, which is very connected to the political culture and the people in and around Westminster, the think tanks and the rest of it.
You get at any of these people. So, for instance, if you were to offer a very interesting POV to the Daily Mail, would they buy it from you?
What do you mean?
If you were to say, I'd love to write about X, Y or Z, a subject close to their heart, to the Daily Mail's editors, would they commission you?
What, me personally?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's very unlikely that I would write in such a way that they would want to publish what I have to say.
It's a very interesting question, isn't it? So is the fact that you're not in the Daily Mail on a constant basis, is that because you feel, I couldn't quite do that, or because they feel, no, we don't want him, or what?
Well, it's the latter, isn't it? I wouldn't write for The Sun, but that's just sort of a personal thing. Yeah. There were periods where like the Daily Mail could have like slightly more critical coverage around certain areas. I mean, I remember after 2008 financial crisis, there was a period when they were sort of quite campaigny around high pay in the finance sector, if you remember. And there was also a period after the Iraq War as well, where they were quite, in their own sort of Daily Mail way, quite critical of the Blair administration. I think like Peter Oborne wrote for them around that time.
Mm. He went from the Telegraph, to the Mail to Byline Times, which is quite a considerable move across the continuum.
But he's obviously been on a bit of a journey, right? But I do remember him being very critical of Tony Blair over Iraq. I mean, clearly very disillusioned, not only with, in the end, amounted to the destruction of Iraq, really, during the Civil War, but also about just how to launch a war on lies, right? So, I mean, as I say, like Peter Oborn's ended up in a very different place. But I mean, so there's sort of wriggle room at the Daily Mail for those kinds of perspectives. I mean, for me, I'm a socialist. I'm very open about that. The Daily Mail is like a committed anti-socialist newspaper. I mean, you'll remember they did this sort of hit piece on Ed Miliband based on his father, Ralph Miliband, who was a Marxist.
A man who hated Britain.
Exactly, yeah, very famous. These are anti-left outlets. I mean, that's what they are.
But couldn't you be their token lefty?
I don't think they have token lefties at the Daily Mail.
They have token black people, they have token gay people, they have tokenized women people. You know, speaking as a feminist, I agree with, they say, you know, there are people who say all those things. So why couldn't you be their token lefty?
What I would do is a completely separate question. But if you look at people who have operated as token lefties at those kinds of outlets, so Melanie Phillips, who I'm sure has come up on your podcast quite a lot, she started out on the liberal left in the late 1970s, then was at The Guardian. Now, I can't remember exactly which right-wing outlet she hopped to and from in the next sequence of her career. But it's people like that.
Yes.
And I think somebody, Nick Cohen as well, I don't know if he had a period at the Daily Mail or not, but he started off at the Observer and then he moved to was he at the Spectator at one point? Sorry, I'm not quite recalling.
I think Nick Cohen still has an attachment to the left, though it's gone a bit, he was disappointed.
Yeah, and it's like, generally speaking, what the right-wing outlets are looking for when you say like a token left-winger is more like a repentant leftist.
Repentant, that's it. Repentant leftist.
Wag their finger at other people on the left or come up with various sort of moralistic critiques about, the left's gone too far or it's become too woke, etc., etc. If you're not doing that, and you're just writing about how the political economy is dysfunctional and actually private equity is draining the value out of everything and we're all being distracted with what the Daily Mail is writing about, I think you'd be out on your arse fairly quickly.
Yes. We've looked at 2014 till now. What about the future? What emerging trends in media land, global media land, and I'm pulling that as wide as possible because the distinction between recognised media owners and people who have what are in effect platforms built on technologies, I don't see that distinction. I think if you own a platform where things are happening and you rule that platform and you dictate to some extent what people say, then you're a media owner, aren't you? So I'm taking that's a long way round of saying emerging trends in media land include Silicon Valley for me.
Yeah, 100%. If you take things...
How do you feel about what's emerging?
I don't feel very good about it. I don't think anyone else does. I mean, one positive development of the last few years, I think, has been a growing awareness of the danger that ownership of these platforms pose, but also, I think, a sort of increasing sort of disillusionment with involvement or use of social media. If you look at surveys do you enjoy using social media? Most people seem to say that they don't, but the apps have sort of become necessary part of life. So what people tend to do is they tend to leave one app and then go on to another app that's basically doing the same thing, or they spend a period off the apps and then they get back on again for the obvious reason that it makes communicating with people very, very difficult if you're not using these kinds of tools. So there's definitely been a sort of critical turn, but it's not clear that there's going to be any kind of alternative. I mean, I think, having said I agree with you, and I do, the difference between these types of outlets is kind of feels quite arbitrary now. I mean, one point I would make is that, yes, broadly speaking, the ability to publish, to disseminate, to communicate means that, that is media and communication, as we call it, like in academia. The difference is between that and the types of institutions we've been talking about, like particularly the BBC, is that the BBC operates under a specific regulatory framework which doesn't require it to actually turn a profit, but also operates under like particular rules and obligations. And this is also the case, obviously, for the other broadcasters, and traditionally has been even in the United States, right? If you have a broadcasting license, you have to do certain things. You have to produce certain types of cultural content, certain types of educational content, certain types of news and current affairs content. Now, the thing that makes these platforms different, and this also applies to like the video on demand services that we've not really talked about so much, which are the other big rival for public broadcasters, is they don't have to do any of that, right? And if they don't have to do that, then the commercial provider just simply won't do it. So in terms of the future trajectory, increasing concentration of ownership, we'll probably see new platforms come and old platforms die out, because that seems to be the basic cycle. But increasing concentration, and probably as that happens, an erosion of regulation, because basically in order to compete with these platforms, what tends to happen is the regulated commercial operators will lobby again and again to have regulations relaxed so they can increase their profit. I mean, this is an analogy, but you think about what's happened as we were talking about privatization with Royal Mail. So it gets bought and privatized with a guarantee to preserve the specific regulatory requirements around the delivery of first and second class mail. And what happens every 6 months or so is you'll turn on the TV and it will say, oh, now it's going to be 3 days until like second class post is going to be delivered, or it won't arrive this day. And the service gets worse and worse and worse. Once again, nobody gets asked, do you want your mail service to be privatized? But this is the slippery slope that we found ourselves down. So I think the question is, how do we regulate those platforms? And that's a very difficult and very big question.
How do you feel about Ofcom?
I don't feel good about Ofcom. It's under-resourced, and it's basically has a market rationale like embedded within it. So part of the problem that we've had with media regulation over the years is that there's been this conflation of the public purpose of media with a consumerist delivery model. So, and it's not just media. I mean, this happens sort of across the whole sector, that there was this shift in regulation away from public purposes and more towards ensuring the function of an efficient market. Well, the problem with that is if the operation of the market is inherently unuseful in terms of like delivering public purposes, and it doesn't matter how competitive you make the market or how much you intervene, it's not going to fulfill those public purposes. Now, clearly, we need strong regulation. I think I'm broadly in favour of an external regulator overseeing the BBC, but what I would much prefer would be a system whereby the BBC can be more accountable to its audiences, certainly, rather than a market regulator. And I think the other thing is that really, in the end, we can talk about trying to influence what the big tech companies based in Silicon Valley do in the UK. But until we have control over some of, or like alternatives being developed in the UK that are publicly owned and directed towards public purposes, I think you're always going to be playing whack-a-mole, really. You just don't have the kind of leverage, right? It's really, in the end, we're going to be dependent on the administration in the United States to influence these platforms. So, yeah, that's a whole separate problem. But
do you feel that Dame Melanie Dawes understands these issues adequately?
Couldn't comment, really. I hope so. There's been a lot more mainstream debate around these issues, I think, lately, and certainly around like problems of like big tech. I think part of the problem is that some of the debate seems to be more focused on like the influence of like geopolitical actors and these kinds of things, and also misinformation, which is a problem, but sometimes that gets sort of conflated with like a problem of people just posting things on social media, right? it doesn't seem to me tend to have a focus on like power and concentrations of ownership. But I think Musk has really been a wake-up call for people, I hope. So I think that's been a bit of a sea change, actually.
But there is a difference between old legacy media and all other kinds of media, namely that you sort of know what's going on, you know where they live, you know who. It's pretty easy to define all the basics about a message from legacy media, should you care to do it. It's really quite difficult to define who a variety of intermediate people, various kinds of websites, various kinds of channels on YouTube, who funds them, where they're really coming from, whether they've got an explicitly political content concealed. And then again, when you've got platforms, to know exactly who's behind that very interesting thing that's attributed to Dave from Dagenham.
Yeah, I think that's true, but actually I think for most people it's not so easy to figure out, even with the legacy media, like who it is behind particular stories. You've got to remember that you've been knocking around like the politics media world for quite a while, so it's much easier for you to get some sort of sense of who's who and what's what. Whereas I think to some degree that's the problem with the legacy media itself.
I know where Reach PLC live. It's very easy to find their board and their, all that stuff.
But it's not true of the users, I think, is your point, isn't it? So but then you may be aware of where the BBC are based or where GB News are based. It doesn't necessarily mean you know where the stories came from.
In my latest book, there are cartoons of where GB News lives. Very funny cartoons by Martin Rowson. It seemed rather interesting to ask yourself, where are they doing this stuff? Where do they hang out? For a lot of the people on GB News, you think, and who are you? Where did you come from? Of course, sometimes they're very much loved old television stagers who move around quite a bit.
Yeah, so some of them are very well-known faces, aren't they? A lot of them have been sort of ping-ponging around the world of Westminster think tanks, but you've not quite heard of them till you've Googled them. But yeah, you can usually figure out who they are. I mean, going back to the platforms and particularly users on YouTube and these kinds of things, yeah, it is difficult. It's completely unregulated, of course. There's not much right to be able to get behind not only who's funding what, but what the algorithms are, which are exposing you to particular types of content. So these are serious problems. If in the event of, we basically know, to take the point you just made, that who decides at BBC News, or we can find out, or at the Daily Mail or wherever, who basically makes the editorial decisions. And okay, we know who owns X, right? And sometimes it's very obvious that Elon Musk has just instructed one of his underlings that they need to tweak the algorithm for Grok or whatever it's called. However, most of these platforms have these underlining algorithms, and what gets produced and exposed to us is completely black box. We have no idea. And I think we should have a right to know that. And it's one of the arguments I've made writing about the BBC as a digital alternative to some of these platforms, is that we should have algorithmic transparency. We should know who decides what is news at the BBC. We should have some say in that. But when it comes to what content that we're exposed to online, I think we should be able to know what's driving what we're exposed to. I mean, in the end, we have to make our own judgments and our own collective judgments as to how things should be, what we should see, how things should be distributed, what should be given priority. And until we have that knowledge, we're basically dependent on either unaccountable, patrician, well-meaning people at the BBC who now tend to, at the top, all be Tories, or different varieties of Tories in the press, or different varieties of quite unpleasant nationalists and libertarians and all kinds of odd characters in Silicon Valley and Washington. It's all out of our hands.
Are we going to get more like them? So if we take American Media Land, there seems to have been a deal done, which is sort of represented by the various pens of people at this second Trump inauguration, there was a pen full of Silicon Valley people, which rather reminded me of when Putin got all the oligarchs in a pen and said, you keep your hands out of my politics and you can do what you like. And in effect, that's what seemed to be happening there. But if you were a media owner and you had an annoying subset working within your conglomerate empire, and you were wanting to pressure that subset, you would say you won't get your broadcasting license, you won't get your deal through if you don't sit on those bad people. That seems to have worked very, very effectively and be very much like Putin and the oligarchs back in the day. Could that happen here? Could they say, the Reach PLC suddenly had a difficult bit?
It's hard to tell what's going to happen under Nigel Farage. That's the question which everyone seems to be asking.
Yes.
Can you really imagine Keir Starmer gathering together some influential media owners and reading the riot act to them in the same way as like Putin or Trump did? I mean, I personally can't. I don't think they would take him seriously.
I know, I can't.
And I don't think
this.
he'd be inclined to do it because his entire politics is about doing whatever these people want him to do, or at least making enough of the right noises to keep them satisfied. As for somebody like Nigel Farage, were he Prime Minister, I mean, who would he be reading the riot act to? It would basically be The Guardian and the BBC. Those are the outlets that he doesn't like. Would he care enough to tell The Guardian what to do, and would The Guardian listen? Probably not.
I know, I can't quite see this.
So really, I think your question simply boils down to a more straightforward question, which is, what would Nigel Farage's position be on the BBC?
He said he hates it.
Yeah, he said he hates it, and he probably does. I mean, whether he's genuine or not is sort of an irrelevant question, really, because he's a politician. How would the BBC respond to that? Well, we know that they will try and bend and bend and bend at hope of not breaking. I mean, that's always been their position. And I think that story that we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation around how the BBC should engage with reform voters. I mean, clearly these are conversations which are taking place in the context, the anticipation of a hard right government and the BBC trying to figure out what it's going to do about that. Because in the end, the people at the top of the BBC have two things on their mind. Like, one is short-term reputational management, which they're absolutely awful at, and the other one is like the long-term economic sustainability and political sustainability of the organisation. They spend the whole time in conversations with people that they know are going to be calling the shots in government, and these people aren't stupid. I mean, they're quite incompetent, but they're not stupid, and they know that they may be facing a Nigel Farage government, and I can't see anyone at the current leadership of the BBC who would be mindful to stand up to such a government. That's not what the BBC tends to do, even at the best of times. It doesn't see itself as standing up to power. I mean, funnily enough, they do mention actually in their speaking truth to power or something along those lines in their editorial guidelines, which I was quite surprised when I saw it. But that's not their journalistic ethos.
Do you go on the media show?
Yeah, I have been on, yeah.
And did it feel nice?
Yeah, it was fine. I went on and talked about mutualisation of the BBC.
Yeah.
I think they had me on because Lisa and Andy had spoken about mutualisation and nobody seemed to know what it meant.
Yes.
I'd written about it, so that was what the opening was. I mean, I think the media show can be quite interesting. I think they tend to not be so keen to have academics on. I think there's this sort of culture there that really the people who are best qualified to talk about the media are the media themselves because they know it best. And so there tends to be the sort of, I mean, it's not just the media show. There's a few shows and podcasts like this where, it's a funny thing, the British media, because on the one hand, people who work in it do like to talk about themselves a lot. However, it tends to be from a particular perspective and they tend to be talking to themselves. I mean, not that they don't have experts on, academics on, they do. But yes, I think it can be, unless you're going on in a sort of niche sort of expertise, it's not the most welcoming place for media academics, I think.
No, there's this thing. Now, MRC are media analysts. You produce that fantastic analysis which makes complex things very simple and very dramatic. The 90% thing is very simple and very dramatic. And your media activists and media lobbyists, how effective are you at the lobbying bit?
Yeah, we sometimes get a good pickup. I mean, we often engage in correspondence with Ofcom, select committees, government departments and the rest of it. So we try to feed into that as best we can. It's worth saying that, like, you know, what we're trying to do at the MRC is sometimes lobby around like specific areas which we think can be important and we can get some leverage, but at the same time try and map out a bit more of a vision for how the media might be different. So we have that sort of punchy publication around media ownership, which a lot of work goes into, a lot of research goes into produce that headline figure. You know, we do work around questions of media plurality on the back of that, some more technical lobbying, but then a lot of what we do is precisely outside of the sort of technical questions that tend to get posed by people in the policy sphere. And we do see ourselves as being slightly set apart from that sort of technocratic debate towards a bit more one of vision. I mean, I think this is particularly true of stuff we've done on the BBC. I mean, we have a recent report that we did with Commonwealth, which is a sort of left-wing think tank, on how the BBC could become a mutual organisation, so one run by its members. Now which is what I was talking about on the media show, that's not an area of policy in the same sort of sense. Like, you can't lobby around that. I mean, you can try and persuade people that this is a good thing to do, and we spoke to the BBC about it, but there aren't those openings, you know? So we're a little bit apart from the mainstream, and that's where we want to be. And when there are openings, we take it. But the debates are always a little bit circumscribed, and they're often, you know, they're dominated by industry actors. That's the reality. If Ofcom takes evidence from people, who is it overwhelmingly who's able to submit evidence, who has the resources to do that? It's the big media groups. So,
but I want to see your research being talked about, and then you coming up to confirm these amazing facts, the 90% thing. You know, so that engaging looking couple that they have on the media show, and they say, did you know, dear viewers, that, you know, 3 plays 90%, and here to tell us all about it is whoever from the MRC. When I next see any of those people around, they sometimes go out, you know, they go to Edinburgh Telly Festival and things like that. Where are the MRC's numbers, I want to say? I'm a loyal viewer. I love the BBC. I want it to live forever, though somewhat changed along the lines all sensible people have thought of, independent of government. And I want all these marvellous figures being told me. If I were a real person, you've implied that I might not be because I've been infected by meeting media geeks and so on, and I quite understand. But if I were a real person, I would want somebody to tell me this stuff, because I might not know it, and it might change my mind about everything, and so forth. I don't want all this very fascinating stuff, all these very fascinating analyses, going no further than the geek wall. I want them going out there to everybody. But you're saying you're not banned from the BBC?
Not that I know of.
No.
Look, I think having written a book called BBC Myth of a Public Service probably doesn't make you the most obvious welcome BBC guest. But one show that I've done a few times was Talkback, which is in Northern Ireland, and it's a brilliant show actually, because it's a really good example of like how the BBC can do things differently. But I think the ongoing problem with this is that you do get much more diversity at the BBC around the edges, right? And it's only once you get to the centre that there's a real like sort of discipline. And I think the media show, it's because of its audience, it's an industry audience, that they would probably be a little bit more wary of that. But no, I mean, I'm happy to appear on the BBC. I have a few times. I've been on Newsnight, I've been on the media show, and probably lots of others that I've forgotten about. So as far as I know, I'm not banned.
I'm just saying here, power to your elbow. I could go on talking about these issues forever, But I just want to put to you one fantastically important question, and you'll recognise, and the moment I say it, you'll recognise its fantastic importance. What style group did you belong to as a teenager? Was there an I'm with them, meaning a stylistic group, a subculture? So, for instance, Georgie, who's here helping me today, and when she isn't doing that, she goes and photographs a variety of young people, some of them who are inventing new styles for themselves, and some of them who are reinventing, who are being latter-day goths and mods. And, if Wigan Casino still existed, she'd be down there.
Yeah, I was definitely not a mod, there were no mods by the time I was a teenager. I was definitely not a goth. I don't know why I would have been, really. But I grew up in became of age at a fairly boring time, because it was like the 1990s, right? We didn't really have, I think they were called emus there, but they didn't call themselves that. And so there wasn't a very strong, teenage subculture in the same way. You basically, how things worked that time in the 1990s, you just like particular type of music, and that sort of defined what you were like. And then me, I would have been a mix of I suppose a bit of an indie kid in the mid 90s. So all of the bog standard dreary Britpop stuff, and I loved hip hop. But you wouldn't have spotted me in the street and thought there's a hip hop kid, because I didn't dress like it. So it wouldn't have been an obvious cultural identity. And I don't think either I would have dressed like somebody who was into indie music. But if you'd stolen my Walkman, that's what you would have discovered.
That's how we'd have known it. It's very interesting. And music has been historically a great organiser of people, and a great organiser of what's the tune in their heads. I'm not sure it is now to anything like the same extent.
Well, it's partly because of this change in political economy that we've been talking about. If you have something like Spotify, which allows you to pick any song from any point in history at any moment, there's no work involved in collecting together the different types of music. But also, once you've invested in that, and you have to develop a community around it. Maybe somebody from school, or in my case, somebody from school's older brother who knows about X, Y, or Z, and you can find things you think are cool. That naturally creates subcultures, and that's all very splintered, right? And then the other thing you find, even in terms of political identities, I forget the academic's name, but they were doing a lot of work talking to young people about their political formation. And one of the things they found was people just bounced around like crazy. When you originally asked me about what group I belonged to, I thought you meant politically, which the answer was also not a group. What you would find is that people have a clear identity that they take into their 20s or whatever. Or again, I wish I could remember the guy's name, but what he found was that people could swing about all over the political spectrum over a short period of time. Because if you're on YouTube, you can just go down one rabbit hole or another, just in the same way as you can listen to Spotify, and you can jump from 60s to the 90s to the 2020s, and it makes no difference. Everything's sort of mixed up.
So at what point did you say, Dad, I've got to tell you something, I'm into politics? When did that happen?
I think I'd always been political. I probably obnoxiously called myself a communist in my early teens. In your early teens? Probably, yeah. And were there influences around you could pull onto? Really? I remember, same as everybody really, I remember reading Animal Farm in year 7 or 8, the first year of thinking, oh yeah, I think I'm still on the communist side of this debate at probably the worst time in history to think that, because I suppose it would have been just after the fall of the Soviet Union. But again, the 1990s were not really a time of obvious political identification or movement. So you had the rise of the anti or old globalization movement in the late 90s. So, I read a lot of Naomi Klein, and then became much more politicized after Iraq. Bring back Naomi Klein. Wasn't she wonderful? She used to come here. I went to 3 of her mass rallies early this century. And that almost got me to the point where I was a political person, and then it lapsed away. I've not read it, but she does have a relatively recent book out called Doppelganger, which is about online culture. Yes, about her and the other Naomi. Yeah, that's right. Because they confuse her with, I think, Naomi Wolf. But she is completely wonderful. The answer to all Britain's problems is regular tours
She's Canadian, as am I, sort of, and she's a very good influence on us. Tom, thank you very, very much for sharing your thoughts about actual and impending media land. And I feel you're more sympathetic with the BBC than you can quite acknowledge, whereas I may be getting more critical. And we must talk about that when we next meet in the real world.
Excellent. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. I tried to be measured with the BBC, so...
Huge thanks to Dr. Tom Mills. Now, next week we have a special treat. I'm delighted to be talking to Professor Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, former New York Times columnist, and one of the sharpest voices on global economics and policy. We'll be unpacking everything from the state of the tariff war economy to the ideas shaping our future. This podcast is presented by me, Peter Yoke, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do listen in again. Goodbye.